There is no other reality but what shared experience presents to us. And that's where things get troublesome. Because first of all, from a subjective perspective, that just doesn't seem to be true. I mean, it isn't obvious how you can understand the relationship between the fact that you have your subjective experience and the fact of the objective world. We don't know how to put those two things together, and merely ignoring the subjective, well, that causes problems, because, of course, that's what you're primarily stuck with, and it's the primary problem. You know, how do you deal with your isolated individual existence, and what do you make of it? And science, in some senses, it can't answer those questions, but that shouldn't necessarily lead us to the conclusion that such questions shouldn't be posed, or that they don't have to be answered. They do have to be answered, because they're still part of the domain of problems that beset human beings. So it seems to me that for a comprehensive picture of experience or of being, you have to use two domains of analysis, and one is the scientific domain, and the other is fundamentally the moral domain. And the moral domain for me isn't, I'm not really saying precisely that the moral domain is the difference between right and wrong, although I think that that's part of it. The moral domain is actually a broader domain of questions, which is, well, how should you act? Because knowing what is, from a scientific perspective, does not give you a clear understanding of how you should progress through life. And because we're embodied creatures, and because we move, and because we're capable of transforming the world, both with our consciousness and our communication and our actions, there's no escaping the problem of how you should act. And then it's an even more complicated problem, because it's not only how you should act because of your limitations and your skills, but how you should act given that there's all these other creatures wandering around that are asking the same questions and trying to act just like you are. So other human beings, and then of course the fact of the world, the non-human, the living non-human world as well, which is something that you have to have a relationship with. And you can't just ignore those questions because they're not easily answered by the mechanisms of empirical science. It leaves people bereft. Now, it's a complicated problem, because it isn't at all clear to me that the landscape of stories that make up our cultural past are in fact scientific descriptions, and I don't think they ever were. And the fact that the manner in which they describe the world seems to contradict what we understand, say, from cosmology, to me it's basically irrelevant, because they're not dealing with the same problem. But you can see how it has been easy for people to become philosophically confused, because it's not self-evident that you may need more than one kind of truth to live. It's not even self-evident that there is more than one kind of truth. You know, but why we assume that there would only be one kind of truth is a mystery in and of itself. It seems to me that it's related somehow to the push in humanity for a form of monotheism, you know, or a totality of one theory governs all. Well, maybe that's true in some ultimate sense, but it certainly isn't the case that we're at that point yet. So we might say, well, maybe we need all the kinds of truth we can get our hands on, and all the tools that we have in order to live properly, and we can sort out the fact that some of them seem to coexist paradoxically. Well, we can just live with that for now and accept it as a necessity that might become, you know, the reason for which might become more clear across time. So it seems to me that for psychology, to be a psychologist, you have to take both these domains very seriously. You have to learn everything you can about what science has to tell you about what it is that you're like and what the world is like. And then you have to learn everything you can about what history and culture and also the shared communication between people tells us about what the appropriate ways are to conduct ourselves and to what ends we should be working. And those are all valid questions. And if you ignore any of them, you ignore them at your peril, because you have to know them in order to minimize the degree to which you're going to suffer unnecessarily, or that other people are going to suffer unnecessarily. So it's not optional. you see that this sort of dichotomous truth, the problem of this dichotomous truth shows up in all sorts of binary oppositions in terms of forms of knowledge, you know. So there's the objective reality, which no one really lives in because it's a third-person perspective, right? So it's a hypothetical kind of reality, but conceptualizing it seems to be very useful. And then there's the phenomenological perspective, which is your experience is actually reality, and that's what counts, and those two things aren't the same. And that's sort of like the difference between objective and subjective, and it's sort of like the difference between scientific and moral, and it's sort of like the difference between materialistic and mythological. And so those are all dichotomies, or paradoxical juxtapositions of forms of conception that seem to be hitting at this paradoxical relationship between being and becoming. So we considered both sides of these paradoxical conceptual schemes as we walked through the class material. Einstein said, by the aid of language, different individuals can, to some extent, compare their experiences. Then it turns out that certain sense perceptions of different individuals correspond to each other, while for other sense perceptions, no such correspondence can be established. We are accustomed to regard as real those sense perceptions which are common to different individuals, and which therefore are, in a measure, impersonal. The natural sciences, and in particular the most fundamental of them, physics, deals with such sense perceptions. Well, it's Einstein, and obviously Einstein was a great thinker. There are things missing about this description of what constitutes science, because the other thing that constitutes science is a description of the procedures that led to the emergence of the sense perception, right? You think about how a scientific paper is written, it's not only results, it's method and results. And the method is how I constituted my body in time and space to produce these particular sense perceptions. And so it's a way of formalizing behavior and then pairing it with the consequences of behavior and then communicating in a way that someone else could hypothetically duplicate that. So Einstein's pure focus on sense perception is not complete. You can't forget about the systematization of procedures in science, and it's easy to forget that. But apart from that, it's a pretty good summary. Your being is more like a play than it is like a collection of objective phenomena. And then what happens is the play itself, like a Shakespearean play, becomes a more accurate representation of being than a scientific description does. And it's because it plays out, it's because it accounts for behavior, and because it plays out the consequences of behavior from the subjective perspective, because a good play elicits the sort of passions and emotions and motivations that are subjectively experienced that actually characterize your life as you live it. So what that means is the play, a novel, a book, a story, is an abstracted representation of reality that's subject to just as much rigor in terms of conception as a scientific description of a given thing. And it's also real. Well, it depends on what you mean by real, right? Because we already found out what the scientists think of as real, but there's lots of arguments about that, because I might say, well, I would judge what you consider real by watching how you behave, not by listening to what you say about the structure of the world. And that's an existential perspective as well. And so then I would note that regardless of what all of you might say about what you believe about the nature of reality, it's certainly the case that you're going to act as if your own perceptions, your own subjectivity is real. So for example, if something hurts you, you can think all you want about how pain is not objective, but that's not going to get you out of the painful situation, and you're still going to configure your behavior so that you're going to do everything you can, even involuntarily, so that you will work to avoid that pain. And so you're stuck with acting as if your subjectivity is real. And that happens at such a deep level that it supersedes your consciousness, right? Like if you put your arm on a burning stove, you're going to take your arm away from that before you even think about it. So the reality in some sense of your subjectivity is so deep that you don't even necessarily have a choice about it.